Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that.
I am Ashley Hales, and I am delighted to join Russell Moore for The Russell Moore Show as we are talking about books. We have these episodes about every quarter, and today we're bringing you kind of an apocalyptically themed summer book list. So, Russell, I'm excited to chat about these books together.
Well, it was not an intentionally apocalyptically themed book list, but I guess it just happens to be. So that probably tells you what my headspace is right now.
I know. I understand. You know, we're going to have Leif Enger on next week about his book, I Cheerfully Refuse.
Yes.
Which is also apocalyptic. There is, a reckoning in these books. And I'm just going to give our listeners just a quick overview. Again, you can find all of these titles in your show notes. But the first book we talk about is John Hendricks. He is the author of The Faithful Spy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and The Plot to Kill Hitler. It's a graphic novel. It has made its way into my children's Easter baskets. It's about the life of Bonhoeffer, and we'll talk about that. Secondly, we have a book by Byung-Chul Han called The Crisis of Narration. He takes theorists like Walter Benjamin and makes a compelling case for the loss of storytelling in an information economy. Then we have another short little book, David Bentley Hart, The Doors of the Sea, Where Was God in the Tsunami, which addresses the problem of suffering. We have an essay of Walker Percy's in his book, The Message in the Bottle. The title of the essay is called The Man on the Train. It's all about alienation. And an edited collection of sermons or meditations of Richard Marius called Wrestling with God. And lastly, perhaps as maybe a way to think, how do we tie all of these books together that can be a little dire at times, but very thought-provoking, is Eugene Peterson's Praying with the Psalms. So, Russell,
the
you ready to...
Psalms can be kind of apocalyptic.
That's true. Yeah, well. You're right. A lot of these books are they're not new releases. Often on the podcast, we talk with authors who have things that are kind of up and coming, research, cultural analysis. Why do you think these books, you've turned to these older books at this moment in time? And they're not like older. It's not like you're reading the Desert Fathers, but...
Well, Percy's is 40, 50 years old maybe. And I turned to that one because returned to it. I mean, I've read Message in the Bottle many times, but I returned to it because I was having this conversation with somebody in Sunday school about the ways that people try to deal with boredom. And so that one came up that way. The John Hendricks book, I just happened across, a graphic novel about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Yeah. I'm in for that. And it was much better even than I expected. And I hope they make a movie out of it, because it was really compelling and well done. With some of these authors, kind of like with Percy, I read everything I started to say writes. He's not writing anything now that we have access to, but I read everything he wrote, and usually over and over again. Byung-Chul Han, I read everything he writes too, because there are just these little nuggets in it that are always, they cause me to keep thinking about whatever it is that he raises in a unique sort of way.
Yeah. Well, let's start with that one. So the book is called The Crisis of Narration. In the very beginning, he talks about the loss of a long, lingering gaze, kind of in our information-glutted society. And he says, in contrast to that, this information glut, that storytelling has, he says, like mysterious edges around it, right? The English teacher injunction, right, to show and not tell. And so storytelling is a showing. And he argues that so much of our the ways in which we communicate today isn't about showing, it's telling, right? And it's all of these kind of accumulation of information data points. So what do you think in that book is particularly important for us today as we think about even our media habits, as we think about, we talked to Jonathan Haidt and we talked about the ways in which our smartphones are forming, particularly younger folks. So as you think about that, how do we bring back this storytelling?
I think the problem is not just that we're not showing, but telling, but that we're not telling, we're consuming.
Yes.
And that's his point, is that there's a way of receiving information. I mean, even just the word information, that's just very different from the way that we were designed to respond to story.
Right.
And as I was reading this, what I thought all the way through is Jesus, because what he's doing is he makes the point that a story is different from consumable information in the sense that a story prepares you as it goes for what it is that it's going to tell you. So if you think about the way that Jesus would say, let he who has ears to hear, hear, and would talk about in John 9 that it's because you say that I see that you are blind. And then the way that when Jesus would tell these parables and his disciples would say, why are you doing this? And he would say, so that those who are prepared to hear them will hear them, and that others won't. Well, that's the point that he's getting at here, is that a story has to have a certain kind of progression, a certain kind of withheld knowledge, a certain kind of mystery. And so, I mean, if you just think about the parables of Jesus, they're not, you can't boil them down to the abstraction and have the same thing. You have to have this sense of, wait, what? The kid went and asked for his inheritance and left? I mean, that ought to hit you in a certain way. And so he's talking about that in terms of storytelling and the way that we've replaced that with, I want to have this immediately. And he uses this example that I've seen him use elsewhere about porn, and arguing that essentially what you have with porn is the reduction of story to information, because what you're trying to do with pornography is to escape the storyline of intimacy and replace it with, well, let's just get to the point with something consumable. And that those are very, very different realities. And when we give ourselves to that second experience, we diminish the ability to have the first. And I think that's so. He's speaking about it not from a moral or theological perspective, but just saying, don't you see what's happening here? And so there are a lot of things that they don't have the moral weight that say porn does, but they have the same shaping mechanism is going on.
Yes, that there's still this sense in which if we continue to consume information, we begin to consume people and places as well, right? Like that becomes the mode in which we're operating. Just to apply it for you, you're the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, right? Storytelling is particularly important, right? As we tell global stories, as we tell, the stories of transformation and testimonies that you see throughout Christianity Today and the magazines. Help us understand how reading this piece about the crisis of narration applies to your own work, Russell.
Well, I see it as a very similar application as one that I would have to preaching or Bible teaching, which is that ladder of abstraction, that the way that people receive something is by, in one sense, to experience it through the telling of the story and the retelling of the story. And we think that that's going to get rote. And yet I don't think there's anybody bored by Christmas. Any
Right,
Christian
right.
that's
Yeah,
bored by
yeah.
Christian or bored by. I had a pastor friend who said to me one time, I just don't know how to preach Christmas because I've been preaching to the same congregation for so long. And what am I going to do that's different from the point of view of the donkey? I mean, what do I do?
Yeah,
I'm like, no, you tell the same story.
yeah.
And that's actually what people respond to. And so you have to have something particular enough
Mhm.
that people are able to see it as more than just a vague abstraction.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's through that particularity that you're getting to something that really is universal. And
Mhm.
so that's why with at CT we talk about storytelling and ideas. If you have stories that don't have an underlying universality to them,
Yeah, yeah.
then they don't matter.
Right.
And if you have ideas that aren't rooted in a bigger story, they
Yeah,
don't matter. So
yeah.
in some places, you're going to have the one being explicit and the other implicit, but they have to both be there
Yeah.
in order for us to really carry out the mission.
Yeah. Another book that I really enjoyed reading on your list was David Bentley Hart's book, The Doors of the Sea, Where Was God in the Tsunami, which he's addressing particularly the 2004 tsunami in East Asia. But really it's more of a short meditation on how could or why would God allow suffering. Um, and it's also another book that touches on themes of alienation and disenchantment that we see in
Mhm.
several of your selections. He says this at the end that he says, "For it is a faith that sets us apart from optimism long ago and taught us to hope instead." So as he's couching suffering within the whole cosmological scope and authority of God, he says one way, that we deal with suffering is to be like, well, I guess it'll all just work out okay in the end, right? This kind of
Mhm.
naive optimism.
Mhm.
And he sets that apart from that and says it actually teaches us to hope. So help us unpack that a little bit, Russell. I think, we've talked about this kind of false hope that
Mhm.
we can kind of have as Christians, maybe in a tumultuous election year that we happen to be in,
Mhm.
that we can just kind of resign ourselves. But what does that look like as we think about suffering, as we think about polarization, to not have this false optimism, but to learn how to hope instead?
Okay, first, in contradiction to what I have previously said on this show, this book, the rereading of it, I read it when it came out back after the tsunami, but the rereading of it happened because of YouTube algorithms. Because there was an interview that happened to come up on YouTube with David
Mm-hmm.
Bentley Hart, and I try to listen to those whenever I can because there is nobody that I can think of that can simultaneously infuriate me and illuminate me the way that he does.
Yeah.
And there will be moments where what I'm thinking is the God you're describing is an impersonal abstraction,
Mm-hmm.
not the God of the Bible. And the
Mm-hmm.
next minute I'm saying, wow, that is an amazingly resonant point. And often he's able to take it apart in really unique sorts of ways. So I came to this book with a sense that was probably different than what it would have been when I read it the first time,
Mm-hmm.
where what I think I probably was doing was theologically arguing with him on
Right.
all the things that I disagree with about how God works in providence and all of that. This time I think I sort of had, okay, we're going to have disagreements. I mean, he's an Eastern
Right.
Orthodox
Yeah.
theologian. We're going to have some
Theologian. Yeah.
disagreements. I just sort of baked those in and instead looked at other pieces of it. And I think I
Mm.
say YouTube algorithm, but there was also, after the YouTube, there was a reference to the book somewhere. And what I thought was really, really interesting about this book is he makes the point, he's not the first person to make this point, but that the question of in Brothers Karamazov,
Mm-hmm.
that Ivan, who
Yeah.
is the skeptical anti-theist there, who's bringing up the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people who will say, "Well, Dostoevsky kind of got carried away writing this and ended up with some really good arguments from
Right.
Ivan that
Yeah.
he's not able to answer in the book. And Hart says no, that what Dostoevsky is intending to do is to intentionally give you these unanswerable questions. So, for those of you who haven't read Brothers Karamazov, sort of the most poignant section is arguing against the greater good that ultimately Romans 8:28-29, God works all things together for good. He talks about the torture of a child,
Right.
and says, what makes up for that?
Yeah.
And that question is meant to come at you with its full weight. And the answer, Hart and some others before him have made this point, that the answer is not a counter argument to Ivan. It's a demonstration with a story that he's giving of Jesus being on trial with an inquisitor. And Jesus doesn't answer the questions. He just kisses the inquisitor and leaves. And that actually, along with the entire life pattern then of the third brother, who lives it out, that's the answer to the question. So it's not an abstract answer. We're meant to have that kind of tension. So I wouldn't argue it the way that he does. I don't think that he treats Job the same way that I would. And I also think he caricatures Calvin and some other folks. But his larger point is right, which is I've known a lot of people who had all kinds of intellectual arguments about the problem of evil, who have fallen apart later when they encountered evil or suffering, not as an abstraction, but as a reality in their own lives. And those abstractions just didn't work. And the answer to that, of course, is that God doesn't answer and resolve all of those things. Instead, what you have is the Holy Spirit groaning from within us and along with the creation. And so there's a sense of, I don't understand this, but I trust you.
Yeah.
It's
Jesus.
a
person. Yeah. It's a person and a story, right? It's the person of hope instead of the abstraction.
And it's kind of, again, the story of a universe is kind of like a story generally, which is there is this sense of mystery. I don't know what is going, and I have to have the experience of walking ahead without knowing all of this, because the alternative to that is not to have a relationship with God that's based on faith, hope, and love, but instead one that puts us as a kind of giving a job description to God as to what it's just an entirely different sort of relationship than that of a child to a father.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of tension is important. So this isn't a book that I would, sort of hand out to somebody who's just had a death in the family or something like that.
Right.
But it's a book that I think makes some really important points for people who are going to be there at that funeral or after that natural disaster.
And I think, the ending of it too really situates the pain of human suffering within a wider cosmos that is under God's providential care, as well as in a wider time frame than, our current moment in time. And I think sometimes when we get so myopically turned in on our either own suffering or pain or confusion, it's really good to have voices to widen the scale a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think you probably have seen this, but Peter Brown, the historian, has a review of the new book Christendom in the New York Review of Books this week.
Yeah.
And I haven't read the Christendom book, so I don't know what I think about some of his arguments, but he makes a really important point when he says this book doesn't leave room for the possibility of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And that often, and as I was thinking about that, I thought about something Martin Marty said years and years and years ago about just sort of recording Christian history sociologically.
Right. Yeah.
And he says, that's important to do. But what we don't see is that often you have the Holy Spirit blowing through and alongside that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I immediately thought of is the way that a lot of us, I know I do this, and I think a lot of people do, where you kind of look over your life story, maybe even just the story of the last week,
Mm-hmm.
and whether you're dealing with suffering or maybe even more the case when you're dealing with the opposite, when things are going right, then you just sort of see all the coincidences. The way that, and you don't see what's actually going on in your life. I mean, I think about John Piper said, I don't know, I heard him say this maybe 20 years ago when he said, God's doing 1,000 things in your life right now, and you might know about one of them.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think 1,000 is shortchanging it, but a lot of things. Yeah.
I want to go back to the faithful spy real quick, because the figure of Bonhoeffer, right, has kind of been obvious. There's like a lore around the figure of Bonhoeffer. So help us understand how Bonhoeffer can speak to our moment today.
At the very end, he talks about Bonhoeffer's dream the night before he was executed, where he's under the water and there's a hand reaching down. I mean, that was a chill-inducing sort of moment. And I know that I have heard that before and read that before. And I mean, how many Bonhoeffer biographies and studies have I read? But that one, just the way it was illustrated and the way it was told, it just really, I kind of put the book down and went, wow, that's, and I think part of that too is because as I was reading it, I've got here in my library, lots of pictures up everywhere, but one of them that's over there is of Jesus lifting Peter out of the water. Because I think that part of the story is so important, that Peter had to go under the water and sense his own desperation. But then there's that hand. And so kind of reading that and then looking up and seeing the hand, it was,
that's powerful.
Maybe a coincidence, maybe providence.
Maybe there's a storyline through it all, right? You had a collection of kind of sermons or meditations by Richard Marius, written mainly in the 1950s. He's a man who wrestled with faith. He was seminary trained and historian. How come you picked wrestling with God up, and what did it provide for you for this moment of time?
Well, I had read Marius years ago, his biography of Martin Luther. And I knew that he had come from a similar background to mine and had kind of moved away from it. But it wasn't until, again, this is going to be the case with a lot of things that I say, where I will say, I read something and I don't remember where, that prompted me to say, I want to look at that. And so this was maybe a quote or something somewhere. And so I went and found that Marius book. And he's somebody from same part of the world as I'm from. He's an alum of the same seminary that I went to for my MDiv, and who lived through a lot of very, very similar experiences, with the one difference being that he ended up, I don't know if you would say he lost his faith. I think you probably would. I don't know how he would categorize it, but certainly there was a, what we might call now a deconstruction of some kind. But what I found in that was, as one person said to me one time, you can stop being a Southern Baptist, but you can never stop having been a Southern Baptist. And I think that's true with, virtually every communion. There's something unique and formative in that. And what he does at the end, where he talks about the shame of Mississippi Baptist churches in terms of Jim Crow, and other things. And then he steps back and talks about the seeds of renewal happening there in a really powerfully nuanced sort of way that it would have been easy for him not to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that I found really, I found that compelling. And so even though, he and I ended up in different places, I could recognize some of the questions, I guess, even if we came up with different answers.
He could have just had like a one-note story.
Mm-hmm.
How do we help maybe nuance the conversations about, faith and the trajectory of faith in the life of a believer so that we're able to both see, this was painful and hurtful, or this was objectively wrong. But also there was some good here. There's a loss of that both and in a lot of storytelling. And it probably goes back to our earlier conversation about information, right? If everything is just data points, we're losing something.
And also to our previous conversation, I think, about evil and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you think about the way that the Bible holds together createdness and fallenness, that both are true. And Richard Mouw, who's a Calvinist philosopher that I just think really highly of and love that guy. He said at one point, I've heard him say this several times, that he was explaining the difference between his Dutch Reformed tradition and the Anabaptist tradition. And he said, the Reformed world, we say created but fallen. And in the Anabaptist world, or no, it's the other way. In the Dutch Reformed world, we say created but fallen. And in the Anabaptist world, they say created but fallen. And so there's just this point of emphasis. But if you don't have both of those realities, in the same way, if you don't have a reality of yourself as a Christian, whether you do it the way Luther articulated or not, but if in some way, if you don't simultaneously, you're not able to see yourself as a sinner, always in need of grace, and a beloved child, always standing in grace, then you're going to run aground. And I think it's really hard for people to see that. And sometimes I think we do it in the wrong way. If you think about it, somebody could say about themselves, you could have one person who says, I'm a really angry, quarrelsome person. That's just who I am. I'm always going to be a sinner. And that's just who I am. Get used to it. That's a very different thing than the person who is looking through this struggle with quarrelsomeness and temper over his or her life and saying, this is awful and I'm responsible for it. And yet, even in the midst of all of that, I can see God at work. So if you have this very simplistic view that says people are either completely good or completely evil, and you apply that to anybody but Jesus, you're going to end up in delusion or in just complete cynicism. And the same thing is true with any aspect of your life. And so to be able to, I was reading Tanya Berry, Wendell Berry's wife. I was talking about their marriage. And she said, it wasn't perfect, but it was right.
That's good.
And I think that just applies to so much of life.
Yeah. I'm struck with, questions about how do we begin to inculcate that sort of imaginative both andness, right? When there's, just the constant glut of information that we are trying, everything algorithmically is like putting us into camps, us versus them. And it really becomes a mode of maybe Christian hope to practice that discipline of nuance, right?
Yeah. And to be able to, I think one of the reasons that we try to put things in these complete categories right now in the time between the times is because it's just easy.
It is easy.
If what I find out is that you're a bad person, then that means, okay, I know who you are and you're in that category. Or if I find out you're a good person, you're one of us, whoever us is, then that's simple too.
Yeah.
The problem is you can't hold that very long
Yeah.
in either case if you're in actual relationship or proximity to people. So if once you cartoonize somebody as a supervillain, and you tell everybody that's what this, and then somebody meets this person and they see these created aspects of common grace that everybody has, then they're thrown by that. I mean, how do you see that if this is a bad guy?
Yeah.
And the same thing when you're dealing with somebody who's a good person growing in grace, and yet you find out they're a sinner. That's not shocking. I mean, that's one of my closest friends will often talk about in parenting, that the worst thing that you can say to a child is, I can't believe you would do that.
Yeah.
Because what that's doing is giving this sense of, wait, I didn't expect you to be that much of a sinner.
Right.
That
Or just at least hide it.
Yeah. That way. Yeah.
It's not
that's right.
safe to be a sinner with me,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Walker Percy talks a little bit about this in actually a different essay in the book, Message in a Bottle.
Yeah.
He talks about the idea of metaphor. And he says at the end of that essay, we can only conceive being and sidle up to it by laying something else alongside. We approach the thing not directly, but by pairing, by opposing symbol and thing. And I think, you listener may not love the whole idea of metaphor, and, Russell and I could probably geek out about it. But I think, the idea that we have to know things in relationship really speaks into this conversation as well, whether it's a person or even a thing.
People might not like the idea of metaphor, but they're completely embedded in it.
Exactly.
All the time. And embedded in it is a metaphor.
Right. Right.
I mean, everything is so often the problem that we have are the unconscious metaphors.
Right. For sure. Right.
That we have. And Percy talks about that in several places in that book, about seeing a human being as bestial or angelic, rather than seeing a person as this, as he puts it, not an organism in an environment. A human being is not the same as a frog.
Right.
That, you put certain conditions, you're going to get certain responses. Human beings are much more unpredictable than that. And it's because we were designed to be, I guess, maybe that's why I thought of frog, is to be amphibious. We're both spiritual beings and carnal earthly beings, and both of those have to be held together.
Well, one pathway through some of these large questions of suffering and meaning making and, choosing to be proximate and in relationship to people who think differently and choosing nuance, right, is practices like praying the Psalms. So you chose one of Eugene Peterson's earlier books, Praying the Psalms, a small little book. Yeah. How has that been instrumental in your life recently?
Well, I like Eugene Peterson and have for a long time. I heard him being interviewed by Krista Tippett on her program On Being. And she asked him about his spiritual practices. And he said, I know that what I'm doing here is what Seth Godin calls Stephen King's pencil. What kind of pencil does Stephen King use? If I use that, I'll write like Stephen King.
Right.
That's not true. But he said, I pray through a different psalm every day. And so on Monday, I pray through this psalm. On Tuesday, I pray through this psalm. On Wednesday, I pray through this psalm. I wrote all those down. And then he says, and so on.
Yeah.
And so I had this list, but I didn't have the full thing. And I found that really helpful, not because I think, oh, well, Eugene Peterson has declared this is the way to do it, but because I thought, well, this gives me a little bit of a prompt. Of a way to pray. And this little book that I came upon later, it's actually a day-by-day devotional, which is not usually the kind of thing that I like, but this is just the psalm and a prayer. And he uses the full range of the Psalms. So they're imprecatory Psalms. It's everything. He's not afraid of any of it.
Yeah.
And then he kind of just gives you a prompt as you're starting to think to pray. And I find that really helpful.
That is good. I mean, I love Tim Keller's book, Devotional on the Psalms, but I do love Peterson's. Just like you're saying, it's kind of like a story prompt, right? It's just like a writing prompt of like, okay, here's a little framework to get you going.
That's right. It's like my wife and I were talking about. There are all of these. Her dad wrote a kind of memoir of his life, just for him and for the kids. He died 10 years ago. Somebody found that. And so sent it around. And we were reading this. It was absolutely gripping, talking about his childhood and all these things, none of that we knew nothing about. And then it gets to a certain point and it's over. And you're like, you haven't even gotten to age 20 yet. There are all kinds of questions. No. And she was talking about, shouldn't we, a lot of people, what they do is they have a series of questions that, is kind of a template that you just sit down with a mom or dad or grandparent or somebody and you ask these questions, and that gives a prompt to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And I said, I'd love to do that with our moms, but I don't want to communicate, oh, we think you're about to die, which is not the case.
Right.
It's just that we want to have this. And I said, well, I mean, we homeschool partly, so let's just assign it. If you call and say, I've got this as an assignment, then it gives you a prompt of just things that you ordinarily wouldn't have thought to bring up that come up. And I think the same thing happens with prayer. It just gives you a little bit of a nudge to say, oh yeah, I really haven't thought to bring this up in prayer.
I just created a template for praying through the Psalms, for our church this week and over the summer. And you realize in the same way that telling stories, right, creates community, like common prayers too, right?
Yes.
Create community as you share them. Yeah, that's important. That's good.
It really does. And I think that what sometimes people don't realize is that you don't have to be in a high sort of liturgical tradition in order to do that. I mean, so whether you think that having a Book of Common Prayer, for instance, is the right thing to do, which I love the Book of Common Prayer.
It's great.
And I'm a low church Southern evangelical. But even if you don't, having what you're talking about, where maybe you say, we're just doing this for a summer.
Right, yeah.
But we're all praying it together. I mean, that focuses you and it causes you to connect with one another in ways you wouldn't have ordinarily.
Yeah.
I mean, it's because the problem with prayer is we pray about what we're thinking about. And sometimes we don't realize what we're not thinking about, but it's just under the surface. And a lot of times if you have a prompt, brings that right out.
Yeah. Okay. So as we conclude, do you have any fun beachy reads that are on your summer reading list, Russell?
Well, I mean, fun for me.
Yeah.
We were at the beach last week and I'm reading, and it just took me a long time. I'm still in the middle of it, but Malcolm Guite's book, Mariner, which is about Coleridge and the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It is, I mean, you don't have to care anything about that poem or poetry at all to be able to just be swept up in this, in what he's talking about in this. So that was a lot of fun for me. And then I'm reading this, and I hesitate to say this because I often will not say things that I'm reading because I'm hate reading them's not the word, but oppositionally reading them because I don't want people to think, oh, there's this series, the Egypt with an A series by John Crowley, which is essentially a Gnostic parable is really what it ends up being. So I'm reading this and the storytelling is really great. I'm 3 volumes in. I reject almost everything about the underlying worldview, except that he's arguing that there is more to reality than what can be seen. There's more than one history of the world. is what he says in there. So I agree with that, but I disagree with a lot of the occultism and pan elevation and that kind of thing. But it's kind of like anything else. I know that going in, and so I can both enjoy the story and I can say, "Oh, what a contrast Jesus is." You have to be careful with that because it's easy to say, "Thank you, Lord, that I am not as this publican." As this Gnostic. It's easy to do that. But it can, if you go in, if you know that, then the contrast that's there is powerful sometimes.
And it's just really good to read a good story, right? That opens up new connections as well. So, well, thank you. I feel like this conversation ended up being way more hopeful than I thought, as we looked over your book list.
Apocalypses often are.
That's true. Something is being revealed, and sometimes it's, hope in the midst of deep and dark suffering. So thank you as always. It's such a pleasure to chat books with you, and we'll continue to talk about the ideas that matter. So thank you, Russell.
Thank you.
If you enjoy The Russell Moore Show, take a second to share this episode with a friend or leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Host is Russell Moore. Produced by Ashley Hales. Associate producers are Abby Perry and Mackenzie Hill. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.